Hey there, everyone.
Thought I had it.
Looks like Docker Hub has been playing around with refers lately.
Yeah, I don't actually know what the details are there, but I do know that they deployed something this morning, and it looks like well, I saw you close your issue, so presumably the
They
test
they fixed
test suite is happy.
they fixed the glitch. I'm not going to say the test suite is happy, but they don't break things, so that's a plus. I think they took the header out that they were posting, and so the client does the fallback like it should. And we are starting today with minimal agenda. So if folks have something you want to chat about, we got plenty of time today to chat. Like we've got a handful of pull requests and whatnot that have been sitting in the queue for a little bit. So I'm more than happy to chat about any of those if folks want to. So I'm curious who here will be making it to KubeCon in Paris. And for folks that aren't going to make it to KubeCon, who is going to get up early to attend a remote session if they have one? It did say same Zoom, so potentially yes. Even day back again, feeling blessed by your presence all this time. Is this just schedule change for you that you're able to make it, or have we caused enough of a ruckus you deciding to start showing up and getting the kids to behave?
Well, I mean, a little bit of both. I mean, the uh, mostly a job change. So,
Well, congrats on the job change. I feel like I keep hearing a bunch of people all going back there, so it's like getting the old gang back together.
yeah, we're getting there.
All right. Well, we are 5 after. So given that, the only agenda item, and I'm just assuming this was Amy. It's got my name on it only because I intended it, but they do have a room at KubeCon in Paris. It's going to be Friday the 22nd, and the time is going to be 2 to 4 o'clock their time, Central European. So that means that 6 a.m. Pacific, 8 a.m. Eastern. For folks who want to get up very early on a Friday morning. And we should probably start planning an agenda on there at some point. I know us typically we tend to push stuff off until later and then find things put in the agenda. But if you've got ideas you want to throw in there, feel free. We can start adding these to the list, start chatting about them. And there we go, agenda done. So now does anybody have stuff you'd like to chat about? Open issues, open PRs, rants about crazy things that I keep doing with OCI layouts? Go for it. We do this every week. Everybody gets really quiet. And then before I have a chance to cancel the meeting, somebody goes off on a 50-minute discussion.
Well, now that you mention it,
Got your chance. Otherwise, I might start canceling the meeting early here. John, I haven't seen you in a while. How are you doing these days?
I'm very tired, but I'm alive.
Stephen, anything we need to do to keep our order and the house in order here?
No, I mean, I did well. One thing I had a question about, like, what's our like timeline for like 1.1 compliance right now? Like, what are we expecting?
Or how long it's going to take registries to update?
Yeah.
Because that's kind of the only challenge there.
I mean, a lot of
I don't
them
have a hard-
already are. Like the like gotcha there was, in fact, I don't remember if it was Azure or AWS. Might be picking on the wrong person here, but like one of them was just waiting for the release of the spec to flip the switch more or less, and that seemed to be a relatively common sentiment.
Well, we've got Michael and we've got Sajay here, so they might both be able to chime in on that. Sajay, I know you're just walking in the middle of this one, so I'll pick on Michael first. How is it looking over there for the 1.1 support?
sorry, my head is still spinning right now. What did you just ask?
Yeah, I was
Well-
like, you just walked in on this one.
Well,
looks
so
like
so
Michael
do we
just
have
got there.
do we have support in like the CNCF distribution project? Like, have we landed 1.1 support in there yet?
I haven't followed. I feel like they're still working on it.
No, I don't think it's landed in distribution yet. Last I checked. So
Michael, did I interrupt your lunch?
Sorry, I was having trouble when you hit record. I like can't use any of the buttons on Zoom until I hit
You have
OK.
to find that one box somewhere off the side of the screen. Yeah.
To unmute and nothing's happening. We are working on putting the finishing touches, and so it's hopefully coming soon, but probably not in the next month. I think that's all I'm supposed to say on a recorded line.
Sajay, the question you walked in the middle of was, how is it looking for 1.1 support on major registries out there? And so I was wondering if you might know anything about what's going on over in ACR.
we haven't run the conformance test yet, so I'll check on that. If there's any edge cases, but we haven't announced a date also as to when we'd support it. It's pretty much in the same state. Like most of it should be working, but we were in an RC state. But I still need to get back from the lead on the ACR side.
And I
Yeah.
have absolutely no voice to speak for Docker Hub, but I know they've been doing something because they flipped the header on for a little while until I complained that it was breaking all my stuff.
Yeah, as far as I know, there's no timeline or yes or no. It's somewhere in planning. And I'm thinking about it here. I said Azure and AWS, but actually I know that it wasn't AWS who had it in a turnkey state because the conversation I had with Jesse Butler. So yeah, no, it was Azure and Sajay I was thinking of. We had the things working with the RC.
And to your question, Sajay, about distribution, I know they have an open issue over there. And I think they've had a PR and work for a while. There's Tianon with the link.
Oh no, I just went to paste it for Sajay and Tianan beat me to it.
I would say to your point, Stephen, yeah, we released this without a lot of registries implementing it. But when we were trying to get registries to implement it, they said, we're not going to do it until you release it.
Which is there was a PR and distribution. I think this is the one, and that's more or less okay, Zoom has taken away my ability to chat. It's PR 3834 on distribution. One of the maintainers was working on it for about a year and got frustrated with the changes between RCs, and so just said, I'm not going to touch it until it's final, which, you know, I think was a common sentiment.
Amy, I'm guessing you threw the agenda item on there to talk about the KubeCon.
I mean, it'd be nice if we had an agenda for that, but you know, we got a couple of weeks. So, you know, just letting you know. There's the room. Zoom is here. It's gonna be fun.
I made the announcement, and so I don't know if anybody here is going to be there. Nobody raised their hand when I asked earlier.
Okay, then I mean it's a small room, it might be a quiet time. We'll find out. That's fine.
Yeah. I'll at least, if there is a Zoom to go in remote, I'll at least jump on that. We'll see if there's anybody from the West Coast that wants to get up at 6 a.m.
That actually reminds me, I'll ask here. Is there a in-person meeting at Container Plumbing Days?
Container plumbing days, I don't know yet. KubeCon is kind of where we're focused on right now.
Yeah, that's the thing. I've heard it alleged by Red Hat people that there will be an in-person OCI meeting there, but I haven't seen
Who
anything.
might be doing the alleging? Because I need to go talk to them.
I'm not gonna name the guilty.
No, it's fine. It's
more of
actually
a
like it's
passing
not.
mention, but
It's not a guilty thing at all. It's just more about like if they know something I don't know, that would be super.
But yeah, and then also like the current web page, which is definitely out of date because it still states that the CFP is open and the registration is closed, also asserts that and this might actually be where it's coming from, which is what was the specific phrasing? Is held together with the Open Container Initiative meeting. Yeah.
Oh, that would do it. Okay, I'll go figure out who's running that page.
Okay. Yeah.
Cool. All right. I will take that one on because yeah, like I know it's coming up, but yeah, as
I
we
just
say,
haven't heard anything from any LF employees, and I figured, Amy, since you're here, like, yeah, I'd
that
bring
is
it up,
completely
'cause it was
accurate to come
unclear.
like track me down on this one, and it's held together with the Open Container. We'll figure it out. Okay, cool. I'll go write some emails and I will get back to you. Cool. However, I'm gonna like the KubeCon thing first. One event at a time. There, Brandon, back to you.
One hair on fire event at a time. Yeah. So, Stephen, do we answer everything there for you as best we could?
Yeah, that gives me an idea. Like, because I saw your issue and I was like, well, okay, well, we're not there, but where is everybody else? So it sounds like we need to get some PRs into distribution. We need to some of the cloud providers need to flip their switches, and we'll be there. So do we want to involve ourselves in that timeline as the OCI, or like what do we want to do there?
From the client side, I am okay with registries doing it at their own pace. It doesn't matter as long as they support any kind of the fallback scenario, which should just be there, barring funny things that some registries do. So I'm okay with registries taking their own time. That's me personally. I know just before this, I was on a meeting with the notation group, and they've got a funny scenario where they wrote some clients that are aware of the fallback tag, but are not aware of the refers API. And so they are requiring that they push the signatures to the fallback tag, even to registries that know it to support the older clients. So that's, I feel like depending on how people implement things, you get into funny edge cases in here, but
We talk about that one?
there is an open issue over there I can point you over to. More than happy
Oh
to share
no,
that.
okay. I guess we didn't resolve that. Yeah. Of the whole like do you have to implement the fallback tag schema if you support the native referrers?
So they were reverse, which really threw me off. Theirs was that they have the, I'm going to get the link here so I can speak to it directly. In fact, let me just open a new window here and I'll share it. Moving tabs around 1 second here. So they have a switch that says, well, they support the API. And that was the thing that they are working on was, do we make that the default or not? Or do we have to have that switch? And one moment, I'll get this in the chat for anybody who wants to follow along at home. And the challenge that I was trying to understand was just looking at this saying, wait, the whole point of everything we did was to make this automatic. You know, users shouldn't have to know whether or not they need to pass this flag. Registries upgrade that gives a signal back to the clients and the clients can update. And through the whole discussion today, there was a bunch of back and forth and me saying, no, that's not how any of this works. But why are we doing all this? And I apparently missed a message down there, so I will read that after this. But the summary that I understand is that it's not supporting or making the tool support newer versions of the registry. It's making the tool support older versions of the client, because the risk if you have a client that is being very explicit and looking for just the fallback tag or just the reverse API is that you get in a split brain scenario where a client that's going and looking just for the tag wouldn't see anything else pushed with just with the refers. But that's exactly what they've got right now, is that they've got existing clients out there today that are just looking for the tag. Does that answer your question, Bjorn? Or did you already get pulled aside on container
Yeah.
based discussions?
No, now I'm following because indeed it is kind of like that reverse fragmentation, I think, from the direction most of us were thinking of.
Yeah, there was a concern before of if everybody's just going to only support the new API and then the content wouldn't be usable on old registries. But yeah, this was one of those where we went the opposite direction and now we're at the opposite problem. I think anybody going forward, if you have a client that is written with everything we've described in the distribution spec and they implement what's in the 1.1 spec directly in the client, it just works however, whatever order the registries upgrade, however they go at their own pace. It's only these weird edge cases where we get like a half implementation we have to worry about.
Is there guidance here needed for implementers? Unlike if they have support, because I'm also thinking, couldn't this happen with cosign?
So cosign has their own tag, which is not the refers API tag. And
Oh, their tag schema is I'm just forgetting that they encode it differently into the tags.
.sig, and yeah, and they've got a little bit of different kind of content they put in there. So they may have a similar kind of, they might have to do both for
But
a
they can tell the
transition period.
difference. You don't have to tell
But
them
yeah,
explicitly to do both native referrers and fallback tag schema. They can just use their tag schema and referrers in parallel, which is much more obvious.
yeah. And what they have to be careful of, though, is verification is the challenge because you don't know how it was pushed. And so verification in this scenario means you need to do both, unfortunately.
Well, and then that's kind of what I mean as far as like guidance for clients is that they would need to push to their old tag schema until they feel comfortable that older clients that aren't referrers aware are sufficiently not a concern. Like
Yep.
they are bound by otherwise, they're in a, well, I guess it depends on like whatever admission controller you have going on, right? But you're gonna either fail open or fail closed. And I don't think either of those is particularly desirable when the signatures do exist.
I've always said that is a policy decision that needs to be pushed to the end user, and they can make up their own mind whether or not they want to fail open or close. And that way none of us have to worry about it. The end users pick their own choice there. But in this case, for guidance, the guidance that I was giving for the notation case was, hey, switch the clients today to upgrade already. So that they're refers API aware, and then they fall back whenever they need to fall back. And it doesn't matter how it was pushed, whether it was pushed with the tag or with refers only. Refers is going to pick it up if it exists, since it's the exact same manifest with the subject field in it. So that would give them a nice window of clients are updated for verification. They all know how to verify, and then eventually you'll flip the switch and start just using the refers API when it exists for pushing. And I suspect it's going to be similar for codesign, but since it's a different manifest and a different tag, there might be a little bit longer of a range there. They've also got a lot more user base out there, I think. All right, you've got all the good topics going on in the chat here. What else we have going on today? Okay, quiet crowd. Sounds like everybody is more interested in container plumbing days. Rom, the next big item to tackle. There have been a few that I have seen.
I think it's probably all the aggregated little paper cuts slash the whole ship 1.1 as is, and then solve people's objections over 1.1 and 1.2, right? Like,
Yeah, and I know that Derek had some ideas for how he wanted to update things, but I'm waiting on that to see an actual implementation or really get some feedback on. I don't have a good feel for what it looks like right now to get feedback on it as it is today. In my time, I've been playing with the platform object supporting more variants. That was one of Tianan's items. We've also got the configuring little note out there of whether or not the config should be unique. Came out of our discussion last week. And it started with, do we need this at all? And then it's ending with the people that were objecting to it saying, well, now we just need to make it a must. And so we flipped from not even optional, just don't include it to a must. So that was a complete 180 there.
But if we make it a must, then we need to also delete all the advice about using the empty scratch config blob.
Well,
That's
the empty
incompatible.
scratch
Like,
blob is not runnable.
That's why we didn't make it a must, is I guess what I'm trying to say is that we can't make it a must because we can't declare that at this level. This is more of a, there are runtimes that heeded our advice and gave this field special meaning that maybe it shouldn't have had, but it does. And so if you want your object to be properly supported in those runtimes, this is advice you have to follow. It's not really spec language at all. It's advice.
The other thing that incidentally I find funny with this PR that you punted on that I've been trying to figure out how to describe is what the heck runnable even is, which at this point I've ended up defining as like converted via a process approximating the conversion in the runtime spec, but like that's unwieldy and not 100% accurate, but like, yeah, runnable.
Could there
Everybody knows what you
conceivably
mean.
exist a runtime that knows how to run this as something? Like if I package my Python code and create a runtime that can execute Python code, that's runnable, right?
There's a whole aside here too about like runnable artifacts, so like runnable things that are not an image and whether or not they must have a config that conforms here of like, yeah, I have like some literal Python files that are packaged up in something with the artifact type and then, or, you know, a custom config media type. And then does my config need to make sure that it's globally unique by including the hashes of the Python file that are described by the manifest? I mean, probably.
Oh, Rom, I think you're opening a can of worms here if you say WASM runnable is different from container runnable.
I'm not, I don't want to derail. Like we can go in circles about runnable somewhere else. I just think it's really funny. Like Tianin has very narrowly scoped this to just making sure that like things continue to work with Podman and Docker, which yeah, makes a lot of sense. But also like the fact that it's scoped to OCI image config and not to custom config media types that would be, you know, artifacts, does amuse me a bit just because people want things that have non-OCI configs to be quote unquote runnable. And then, you know, it's the can of worms again about like, is the config divorceable from the content that it is not even necessarily describing, associated with, I guess. Like, no, that's why we have the rootfs object, but you know, for other types it could potentially be, and that could potentially be a foot gun.
Well, there are runtimes today for WASM. There are container runtimes for WASM artifacts, which puts them in that gray area because there's also ways you can run WASM artifacts without a container runtime.
Well, and that's where like the packaging story there still isn't settled on, like as far as how to encode these things into OCI. My mental model still isn't as like I was trying to involve myself and keep an ear to the ground there, but things kind of ran away. And like now there's this like really complex, like I want to use referrers to build like interfaces to dynamically link WASM modules together at runtime and swap the components out on the fly. That's both very interesting and also like I want more people who have experience working with these file formats to be involved in those discussions too. So.
I've been trying to lead as best I can, which is not great because all I can do is say, hey, here's what OCI can tell you without knowing anything at all about WASM.
There's been a bunch of conversations with James, I can't remember his last name. This is an aside, but Sturvant, cannot remember his name, and Ralph Scolacci at Microsoft about this. So I'll ping you on that, Brandon, if and when we have more conversations.
What you got, Steve-O?
I mean, is the issue here that we like? I mean, the config is. Are we having trouble like evolving on the config? Because like I could see a config where. Well, okay, so the current image config, like the config field inside of the manifest, is really a description of some of how to take the content referenced as its sibling and run it as a layer-based container system. You can imagine swapping a WASM or you know, a foobar or, you know, whatever future config into that and targeting some other kind of system. So are we not able to support other kinds of media types in that config reference? Like what's the issue there?
So I'm muddying the waters a little bit. So as far as like
Okay.
this PR goes, I think it's good. It's simply defining the status quo, which is that a lot of container runtimes, the source of uniqueness, the source of content addressability is actually the digest of the config blob. Therefore, this is the whole Docker image format v2 that eventually became OCI. You need to put the sibling hashes of the layers in there, the uncompressed layers in this case, to give it a sufficient amount of uniqueness. The thing I'm muddying the waters with is just that like there are other things that are runnable where the same concerns probably apply, but this line doesn't apply to them because it's specifically scoped to not artifacts, aka images. That's all. But I mean the like the formats for those not images, those artifacts, is neither necessarily super here nor there right now. For purposes of this PR, it just this is an ongoing point of discussion. Is like what does the config of a runnable WASM thing look like? And what is a runnable artifact, a runnable thing that's not an image that a runtime should nonetheless interpret according to, you know, what people consider to be running, I guess, like runnable.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. I mean, we should give that a name. I mean, you know, I mean, it does have a name, but we should give it a stronger name of like this image config is for, you know, layer-based container runtimes. The thing that I would be worried about is a system where we can arbitrarily replace different parts of the container without having them joined with a single hash, because that's a bit of a nightmare for users, in my opinion.
Right. So that's the whole like, you know, so that's the whole like on the WASM side, to elaborate a little further, like some of the discussion is like, can WASM just reuse the layer-based container format and like kind of like overload it just a little bit, just enough to work, and then use like what, you know, what Brandon's showing here is basically a extended image config? Or, you know, do they just need to invent their own thing, which probably should take some of the design decisions of the image config, but have a new media type? So like that could also be Brandon's thing here, which is inspired by the existing image config, but then also incorporates WASM specific extensions. But the important thing is that like it has the rootfs object to what we're discussing here.
Yeah, I would lean on a separate config media type. Just like we should support that in OCI, and because
we do.
Yeah, and yeah, we do, right? But you know, I think we've stretched that config to do a lot of things even today. And you know, I think having a one that's specific. I mean, like do layers make sense in WASI? I don't know. I don't know enough
That's
about it to
exactly it.
say. Yeah,
That's exactly it. They define their own media type, their own config media type, so that they could put whatever they wanted in there. They took out rootfs and didn't want to include it because for them, they don't have a file system at all. So they don't have the concept of a rootfs. They might have some storage
yeah.
you can make accessible, but
Well,
this just felt foreign to them. And so the comment to them that I was giving was that there might need to be a way to keep these config digest unique for each instance of whatever you're pushing for runtimes.
so but where they're going to get into trouble. So I think that's good. If they don't have an FS, don't have an FS. That's great. But if you go down and look at the component, do they write these imports like no hash?
That's
good luck.
That,
Like,
but to be clear, that's not describing a piece of content. That is describing a versioned interface defined by an IDL that can be satisfied by a component. So that's not digestible content. That is an interface.
This is like,
that's a well-known interface name.
that would be like the kernel Abby.
Yeah.
If you really
Yeah.
squint at it hard. Okay.
I mean, the TLDR on
okay.
this is that if you had two versions of the same WASM artifact, and excluding something like the created timestamp, especially if you're thinking of reproducible builds and you didn't want to put a timestamp in there, you would come up with the exact same config digest for two different versions of the same WASI or WASM artifact. Not the WASM binary itself, because that'll be pushed as a layer, but the config of that.
And then like
Okay.
to Tianan's point, like like this is for on the Docker side, like this is not necessarily a practical concern because the way we plan to support these things is through the containerd snapshot integration, which just digests everything. And I mean, it's not even that the image digest is actually the handle. Like that's actually a Dockerism. It's like containerd works solely in terms of user specified tags, and so we can name them whatever we want, and as long as we can find them later. But there are still like I guess my thought is still that I don't know if essentially like newer image formats, being like the Docker image format v1, where the config blob can be independent of the layers, is going to be problematic for other implementations. Like say Podman wants to do these things. I don't know enough about their storage implementation these days to say whether or not it's a problem for them, but I do know that like the storage implementation that they forked off of Docker definitely would not handle sliding config blobs very well. It might just, they might have already fixed that. It might be a purely hypothetical concern, but certainly it might also be a bit of a foot gun for people trying to incorporate new runnable artifact, new runnable content types into existing runtimes.
I like Tianan's comment that if we can get rid of it, that would be nice. But yeah, I agree with you. That code's already out there.
I mean, and on the actual PR, I think the PR is good. And then my takeaway is that we maybe should create an issue to suggest guidance for whether or not like assuring that the config is strongly connected to the layers is necessary or not for future implementations, and then try to do some research / ping different implementers for input on whether or not this matters to them.
I mean, the reason we put the layers in the config is so that you couldn't reorder the layers inside of a manifest and then take the config and the config with the same hash and get some different container from it. And the way we looked at it, and how we kind of arrived at this was the layers, like the manifest itself, is what the distribution system deals with. Like it doesn't know like how to create a file system or how to run a container or anything like that. And then the config is really for the runtime. And like, you might be wondering, oh, why not use the OCI run C config? And that's a whole nother that's a whole nother
Well, that's
conversation.
machine specific, which is the whole conversion
yeah,
mechanism. Yeah,
exactly. Yeah. So really that config section is like, so the manifest says like, what do I need? Like, what are all the ingredients? And the config is really the recipe of how to combine those together. So like you could imagine, like, let's say you had something that was doing, I was talking about the example of being able to swap out like runtime components. WASM is probably a bad example, but imagine like a what's that project, like app bundle or app build packs or whatever, and you wanted to describe a build pack inside of a config. You could say, hey, this layer is the like application runtime, and this layer is the application, and you could have separate configuration fields for that. At least that's, I don't think anybody's doing that, but I think that's the philosophy of the config and why we include all of that in there. And I linked the like chain ID documentation, and there's also an old blog from Docker. I can try and find. I think Tonus wrote that when we introduced chain IDs into the daemon.
So for the scope of the PR, what's the verdict?
Looks good to me.
Yeah, the PR is just documenting the status quo and making obvious like
Yeah.
what is a very real implementation concern. So the
Yeah.
the larger discussion's interesting, but as far as the PR goes, like I think, yeah, it's
My
Yeah,
only feedback was a
it's
little bit of
important because
wordsmithing.
we do actually report the image ID and containerd via the CRY API to kubelet this way, right? We're using the config digest as the ID. So it is important.
oh, I didn't know Cry did that, but that makes sense because it's the engine API, but gRPC. So
Yeah.
yeah.
And that
Yeah,
same API is going to
in
be
some respects, kubelet was expecting it to be the image ref ID, but or some random number that we generate. But no, we're using the config digest whenever you create an image through CRY API and containerd.
That's still going to apply for WASM stuff as well.
Yes, exactly.
Okay.
Okay, so it's not even hypothetical for the WASM stuff because one of the main places people want this to work in uses the image ID or the config ID rather.
To say that it's not hypothetical, they've got an open PR on their own side and spin because they had this issue.
Yeah. Okay.
We
Yeah.
already did, I feel like we already did this. Why does this feel like we've had this conversation? I thought
Yeah, well, it
we
happened
clarified
6
this.
years ago. It happened about 6 years ago, Stephen, that we were trying to figure out what was the best ID to return. It was a long time discussion. You were probably working.
Everything old is new again.
Yeah.
But yeah, I
Probably
still
also
think like
3
taking the
years ago.
PR as is fine, and there's probably then just some. This is a concern for future runnable things that might want to interoperate with the things we call runtimes that are not even defined in the spec because they sit above the runtime spec and across from the image spec. And anyway, point being that there's probably some guidance as a follow up that's good as well.
So this line that I just linked, we're saying is not good enough. We need to add this new piece.
Your line only applies, not your line, but that line that you linked to, only applies when your config media type is this specific media type, because otherwise this file doesn't apply.
Right, but Tianan's PR also only applies to the image config media type, which is what I was saying, is that it only applies to today's images and not to future.
Yeah, my
He was
PR
updating the
is
manifest.
if you're looking at this field and designing an artifact that fills in this field, you might want to go look at this other document. It's not supposed to be spec language at all. It's just hey, by the way, this field might have a special meaning. Go read this other thing to find out what it is.
Yeah. If you're writing your own config that isn't this other config that we document all these things for, you still need to do that stuff. Or you still want to do that stuff.
Okay. Yeah, this is the right pointer to put it. I agree, Tianan. Yeah, so I'll GTM this. The thing
Do we
maybe one of those wordings is better, but
I was going to ask about the wording. Do we want to adjust that at all?
I don't think we should add any capitalized spec language here. Recommended, should, must. Because this is just a, hey, you might care about this, go look at it.
Yeah, that's a good
Yeah.
point. Should be lowercase. Recommended is not one of the listed words that are capitalized.
yeah, image IDs are internal to the daemon. Like we don't expect two CRY implementations to get the same image ID. I would expect. I mean, they will.
We specify
But-
image ID in the spec as the digest of the config.
Right, but I think we're talking about like what Cry returns, unless Cry did something horrible in their proto buffs. I'm looking now, like it's just a random ID, is my understanding, unless like the Go doc says like this is this field from the OCI image.
Like, I really think we should probably deprecate that recommendation to use config digest as the image ID and suggest instead that runtime should use the manifest digest as the image ID if they need some concept of image ID. But that's a much larger change than, hey, if you're creating one of these, you should go read this other document if you care about backwards compat. Which in the WASM case, they probably don't, because you're never going to run a WASM image on a version of, say, the Docker engine that isn't already converted to container D, where this is a moot point anyways.
So that's the thing, Tianan, is it's not a moot point. Like the two things that one spin ran into this, which is a WASM runtime, now arguably like they should just use a different digest. But the other one that's interesting is Cry. Like Mike Brown's observation was that Cry today is relying on a unique. It's relying on the image ID to be unique as well, because it just returns it unmodified to the kubelet. So like people want to run this stuff in Kubernetes, and it doesn't matter, like the container D doesn't have opinions here about the IDs because Cry does. And so, maybe the argument is that like Cry should change.
Yeah, we need to fix Cry too. That is the argument.
Yeah, but what I'm trying to say is that like it's not a hypothetical, and the cost of changing the digest that Cry uses might be higher than we think. I mean, you could certainly we could add a media type just switch statement that changes the ID. It's not impossible, but like people are already trying to build on this, so it's definitely a foot gun, I guess is my conclusion. Like, yeah, we should examine if Cry can be changed.
It can be changed. We can generate a random ID, but we're already using a different one and it's in cache. So that would break. That'd be a breaking change. We'd have to flush the image cache.
Well, what I'm saying is like if we only did it for non-OCI image config media types, then maybe it would be fine. If you only did a random ID or the different digest for.
Yeah, that's fair.
But like that's a discussion for container D.
Yeah.
So just there are cases. So Tianan, I know we worked the conversation off elsewhere, but Tianan said the manifest should be used as the image ID, but there are cases where the manifest does not exist. I mean, I don't know if we're still doing that in Moby with the container D driver or not, but
we're not doing that in Moby with the container D driver, and anything that is doing that should also save the manifest, right?
Well, but I might have an image that I have not yet packed for shipping, right? That just exists as like a config, right? And I want to be able to identify that without having a manifest.
How can you have layers with just a config? Because it only has the diff ID. It doesn't have the content addressable digest of the layers.
So that is the graph drivers. Like that is the graph drivers.
Yeah,
but
that's how it works.
That's the one use case. Yeah, is this old graph driver.
But we're getting off
you can
that.
Generate,
we're getting rid of.
You can generate the manifest with that data. It's the difference is just your layer is uncompressed tar instead of a compressed tar.
That's the graph drivers. Like that's what the graph drivers do today. So like today's Docker, the one that y'all are familiar with, there's basically, say there's a pile of tars, and then there is the config blob, and we smush those together, gzip the layers, take the digest of those gzipped layers, generate a manifest, and then push to a registry, which is why we have the repo digest and the API, because every time we push to a registry, since gzip's not deterministic, we end up with a new manifest because of new layer digest.
gzip's deterministic, but it depends on the implementation.
Okay, it depends on, especially because some years ago, Pigs was merged, and we use a multi-threaded distributed gzip implementation that is the opposite of deterministic. But yeah, if you do it in a single core and you use a good implementation and you turn down the aggressiveness of the compression, yeah, sure. People didn't like that though.
I'm just saying there were reasons we did it this way. It wasn't just like rolling the old JSON dice.
So for Tianan's PR, merge as is. No rewording.
mean, I think the PR is good as is because the rewording starts to really like cleave to those like having opinions about greenfield implementations, and I think clearly that's unsettled, and we should probably make a follow-up issue because this is describing the state of the world. But then, what about what should we tell the WASM people, basically?
Sold. All right, we got 9 minutes. Can we do another PR like that? That was fun.
While we're talking about this, Nearsight had had a PR to qualify and clarify artifacts.
Oh no, yeah, that one. I think Brandon just linked to it in the last PR.
He did just link to it.
Yeah, because I mean, this is the problem that keeps coming up. I haven't had time to circle back around to this. I need to.
Okay.
But I mean, it's still like we're not. There's two issues I've seen, which is one, not everybody's happy with like the specific, not the ideas, but like the specific like wording, because the problem was we're trying to define some terms that like everybody who works with this stuff knows, but then is not actually in the spec language. And then the other half of it is like the presentation of like, where is it? In fact, I think that was your review, Mike, is that it's like, it's in a weird spot because I put it in the artifacts guidance, but like how we have things structured right now, we don't really have like kind of like a forward or a prelude to the spec. And I think that's honestly what this is. And, maybe I should look more critically at trying to add kind of like the overview of what is the spec? Why is the spec? What does it try to define? Who uses it? Like, that's kind of where this would more naturally fit, but nobody's tried to add that kind of thing yet.
Right.
So I threw a question there, which was, do we want to get some feedback from people that work on runtimes? We might have a decent crowd here. Do we want to mix runnable container images with non-runnable container image content in the same index and throw that on runtimes to figure out? So I think that's
well, so this to me all originates from that of like, let's look at the elephant in the room. BuildKit puts things that are actually artifacts now. They're actually artifacts according to the spec in the index with the runnable manifest, the images, but it slaps a platform unknown on them because that makes Docker and thus things that want to be compatible with Docker not try to actually execute them. And I'm trying to come up with a better way I want to get away from that. So what I would like is to say that, I mean, like actually where this comes from originally is I just want some guidance that says, if this thing is an artifact, which is AKA like artifact plus the config.media type fallback, which I realize now people are trying to get away from. So maybe I should change the language there. But if it is an artifact, unless you know this artifact media type and that I can run it, like say WASM. Oh, I know how to interpret that. I use there's a WASM OCI distribution spec or OCI image spec. So I go interpret according to those rules. If I don't specifically recognize the media type, just ignore it. Which means that like, these in toto attestations that BuildKit are adding, the guidance is, well, unless you know somehow to execute an in toto JSON, just ignore it. And then practically like in Containerd, that means we teach the platform selection code to be aware of the artifact type and to, today the platform selection code doesn't actually know what's an image and what's an artifact. And we just teach it that, and then we can get rid of this unknown pattern and trying to overload the platform object, which is optional on the descriptor of everything.
Yeah, I think that's my bigger question is, do we want to recommend it? I feel like if we put it in the spec here, we're almost saying that as a documented pattern that we expect users to implement. And so I just want to make sure before we document it and say, here's a good thing to do, that we agree within OCI that mixing runnable and non-runnable content in the same index is a good thing to do. And for that, I would look toward container runtimes to say, we'd like to be given a list of only runnable things, or we're cool just having to mix up everything and we'll sort it out when we get it. And
now I'm remembering where Brandon and I were maybe butting heads would be a little dramatic, but like, yeah, I remember where we were in November, because basically I'm going like, yeah, but this is what BuildKit does and will continue to do. And, and you were saying, well, build kit isn't a good enough reason. I want to hear from container runtimes that this is what makes sense to them as the consensus behavior.
But we're not designing the standards in this body. We're documenting interoperability. I think this is the crux of the refers disagreement, is that we weren't documenting interoperability. We were trying to design the standard, and it's gone really well for us.
That
Yeah,
is a
like
fair
as soon as you
point.
write down people tree as a standard.
And like from that point, like I should just go like get PRs accepted into Containerd and Moby, and then if I'm feeling really productive, Podman, and then come back and go like, this is the behavior that these runtimes have as consensus. We should document it in the spec.
Yeah, I don't think we should make the decision to go one way or the other, Brandon. I think we're going to have cases where certain artifact types are known types, well-known types that need to be, supported if they're in the index, if that makes sense. And if not, then we should use the refers API to discover them where that's been configured, if that makes sense. I think there's going to be patterns for both. For artifacts that we don't understand, I think the runtimes are going to need config options to be able to store them in the cache for later retrieval, right?
I think that's the input that I was looking for, which was hearing from someone on the runtime side saying, yeah, we're just going to accept that we're going to receive container images that have a mix of both, and we'll sort it out when we get it.
I mean, if we're trying to like, I think the main thing is that like, it's like with a lot of the WASM stuff is that like leaving so much gray area with no guidance as to like what you might encounter in the real world just is really confusing and frustrating for people. And I mean, one way or another, like we're prescribing something, because if we're saying that like, oh yeah, actually that's a horrible thing, like don't put non-runnable content and runnable content in the same image, and like build kit, that's bad, don't do that anymore. I mean, one, like to Tianan's point, like, yeah, I mean, good luck. It's meant to be a form for interoperability and not a dictoriate. So good luck getting. I wish you the best of luck in convincing Tonus to change something about how BuildKit does things through an OCI spec. But then too,
we did manage.
It is prescribing things the other direction. Like we are still trying to prescribe something.
We did manage to convince them. I'm not sure if we specifically convinced Tonus, but to change the implementation of the OCI index to not include layer blobs for the cache in there. So,
well, I mean, yeah, and it's like it's conformant now as opposed to like the sort of like pseudo OCI accepted by Docker Hub manifest that existed before. Like, yeah, I mean, there's a difference between like, hey, like registries accept this, so you can be more interoperable, and like more or less prescribing, and this is, an objection that's been raised with other PRs against the OCI spec before, is that like you're coming over here and opening a PR on the OCI spec because you don't like how one particular implementation does things and you want to change the rules so that this implementation, is now, well, I changed it in OCI, so you have to follow me. And like, that's very much what I want to avoid. I think what the difference here is that it's just trying to describe, like, it's similar to the platform selection of like, in an absence of any further context or data, here's a sensible set of behaviors. Like we could even get rid of the should there and use milder language that makes it more clear that, but I was modeling this more or less on the platform selection, right? Of the platform selection is delegated to the runtime, but in an absence of any other knowledge about how to do it, you should just pick list item 0. I'm trying to come up with something like that just makes it very obvious what the boundary between the spec and runtime specific behavior is, instead of leaving it totally up in the air.
Well, with that, we are at the top of the hour. So yet again, with nothing, hardly anything on the agenda, and nobody wanted to say anything for the first 10 minutes. We ran all the way to the end of it. So. Unless there are any last calls, I think we should go ahead and wrap it up there. Cheers, all.
Thank you.
Have a good weekend.